Alright, today we're going to continue looking at the band website. So I am in W3 Schools, and I'm going to be looking at, there's a section called Learn How To. When I go down to Learn How To, I'm going to look for Make a Website. Now it used to say Make a Website in 2016, but we're just looking at Make a Website, or Build a Website. And we're looking at this website, the band. And so far we've talked about basically just laying out the draft, thinking about what you're going to be making. And so as we approach these kinds of things, as we approach building a website, we have to start, I always say, do most of your work on paper. And whenever you work mostly on paper, you have your core ideas laid out, and then you can go to the computer and make it. Instead of trying to figure it out all on the computer first, I find that to be less efficient than to have a clear description of what it is that I want to do. And so as this kind of represents, we've got a navigation bar, we've got a slideshow, got a place where there's going to be some descriptions. We're going to break things down into 3 equal parts and then have a footer. Now you could do something like this easy enough in Photoshop or GIMP by just laying out a page. You could lay yourself out a page to represent the I like to use something a little longer and taller perhaps, but this is where you can lay out, and here's a simple way to do it. You can lay things out just like this has. You could call it navigation. I'm going to make a new layer, and I could take my selection tool and I could just simply select a region, something like this. Select those pixels, go in. I can color them whatever color it is that I want by selecting a color. Then I'll go down to my paint bucket tool, a gradient tool, or something like that, and I could just block in that section. And then I could Control D to deselect. So there I've got my nav. In this particular case, maybe I'll have a gallery. Okay, I'll put my gallery in, and I can go and I'm going to make another layer here, put it down below, and I can take my selection tool. I can go and I could say this is going to be maybe my gallery section, and I can color that with a new color, something different. Or if I have a color palette, I could use that color palette. But just for now, I could just be laying it out and blocking it in. So Control D to deselect. So now I've got, if I want to label these, I can go and grab my text tool here. I can choose my font type, and I can put in, I'm going to change the color to be something, well, in this particular case it's going to be white, so I'll put navigation up here. This can be my nav. I'm going to double click this box and I will increase the font. Now I'm not trying to lay in the font yet. Oops, I see that I turned off my nav, so there's my, I'm going to increase that by just dragging it up. This is more about laying out kind of the parts. But anyway, as I go along, I can simply just lay out the portions of it. I could just take this and I could make a copy of it and call this gallery. And I could just move it down, move my selection tool, and I can move the gallery down and just label it. Alright, and I could just go on and lay out my page. Now this is something you want to do ahead of time, so I've got my this, or called a slideshow or gallery, the band, and I'll just box in and just kind of lay out that simple divisions and how you want things. Then you can get more and more precise. Actually, you could go down and talk about, if you want to get down into the precision of laying things out, you could lay it out according to the grid. Show your rulers, and then it'll tell you how wide it is, and as I zoom in I can go down to pixel widths and choose all of that. This is going to be 20 pixels wide. This is roughly 60 pixels wide, and go on from there and just kind of lay out my plan. Now you could do it in Photoshop, you could do it on paper, whatever, but something like that will be beneficial to you as you start to lay things out. And then you can get even more specific, because usually your sections will have smaller sections. So this could be inside of it could have, so you might have on the outside of, you have a row and then a container on the inside of that. And so when I draw things out, I actually end up labeling things a lot more precise, because things can get very confusing, and I've discussed that in another other video. So I'm going to move on. We're just taking this and we're breaking it down, and we're moving into the next sections where we're going to be break down after the first part was to work with the navigation. There's a series of videos where we break down the navigation and we look at other parts and examples, and then we looked at the screen, the gallery here, and so, or the slideshow. And then so we're going to move on now, and we're going to look at this next section called the band breakdown. Basically, this is where we're moving past the kind of like that, and we're getting down into this area. And so we're going to start looking at how they've broken it down. So they moved down this. All of this was being contained in a section. This section is holding the pictures that are being seen up in this area. So now we're into the band description portion. All right. So the band. We've got a section. So they break a new section out. The section begins here and ends there. It has a class of W3 container. So recall, W3 containers are going to contain all the content, or it's going to be a container that has padding on it. So whenever you're looking at things like this, we're going to be learning the W3 CSS at the moment. But these may it's the same kind of principle. No matter what. I mean, as this evolves, this might be CSS4 or W4, whatever changes. The idea is this idea of it's a container. It adds 16 pixels left and right padding to the HTML element, and it is good for using as all kinds of different divisions. We've used these kinds of things before. It's got equal margins, common paddings, alignments, and when you use it, you can modify it, and you can see by adding colors. So what I like to do is go here. We can break things down. I'm going to close this one. We can break things down. We can go in. I always like to just see what it looks like. So I always just color something. I color it so I can see it. Okay. So the container is right here. And that, if we go back, okay, so here's my container. So if I were to take this out and run it, you can notice that the text now hits the edges of the container. All right. You'll notice that it has a narrowed space. I'm going to go back. I'm going to undo that action. Notice that now I have my padding. But this is weird because it's got this padding. But if you'll notice, they've added a style to this of 600 pixels. So if I was to make that even smaller yet, it's controlling that section. Well, that's because of the W3 content. And so if we look at W3 content, I'm going to just look that up real quick. And because what I think is important is for you to look at all of these, and this is the kind of things I do. Whenever you go through this, you've got to look at the different elements, try to figure out what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, and see what happens when you take them away, or what they're contributing to the actual page. Let me see. So that's not what I'm looking for. Let me go back. W3 CSS content. Oop. Here, I think the easiest place to find it is when I go here. I like to go to the W3 and then the references down at the bottom. And here's where you can have a whole lot of different classes, container classes, and where you can look at the different examples. And one of them is content, and I want you to find it. We want to find it. Here it is. So this is a container for fixed sized centered content. So fixed size, if you're looking at this, when we have a container with content in it, what it will do is you'll be able to define the max width. So here's our body, and the body itself has a width of so many. So if I made that smaller, you can notice how it changes everything. So it's kind of constricting in things. Now, in a lot of the things that we had done in the old way is like we had something that was fixed to a specific size. This was before fluid responsive. We kind of had to decide this is the width that everyone needed to see this at and lock it in. And that isn't really how things are anymore. Things need to be a lot more responsive to the size of the device. But we can still add this kind of feature as a design element, and this is what kind of what's been going on. So I'm going to go back to my tutorial where we were, and that's why this section has a little bit of a narrowing, because they've used this content. So that's what happens when you take the content out. And center, if you take center out and run it, it takes out some of those elements too. So I'm going to put in put the red back in, as I'm kind of, that way we can just kind of see where everything's at. Notice that the content in here, this is now flowing to the left hand side. I took that out. We took center back in, W3-center, and run it again. Notice how this is all lined back up. So those things are being controlled. Another thing that's kind of interesting is this attribute. So we've got W3 class, we've got wide. They're using the wide attribute if you were to take that out and run it. So I'm going to be looking at, that's the H2. So this is going to change that a little bit. So it takes out some of that space. So W3, it gives it a little bit more width in between. And then this one is kind of interesting, because if you'll notice that it's slightly pink, and that's because they're using what's called the opacity attribute. If I was to take this out and hit run, that now notice that the opacity value is basically, there is no opacity. So they're using that to add that a little bit of style. Instead of adding a color, they're just adding the opacity. And you can see how it adds a little bit of a flair to it. So that sort of thing is very useful. It can be anyway. Now, they're adding that onto the class. Now, if we wanted to change something, like change the color of the text here in the P area, that is something that we would want to be able to do. And you can look through the CSS. And one of the things reason I'm going back and forth on all these is so that you can find these things and manipulate them. So we're going to look at this text coloring.